for having me. It's been
Thanks.
great to listen in for a bit about what you've been talking about. And so I just wanted to comment a little bit on what Bill and Janice were talking about first before I get into the MAPS update about this idea of burnout in healthcare providers. And so we've been approached by several different people, either suggesting funding or some sort of study that they would like us to do in healthcare providers who have experienced a lot of trauma from seeing a lot of deaths or being overworked or worrying themselves about getting infected and potentially having health consequences, including death. And so the one main response I've had, at least from our perspective, is to keep in mind that most people who are traumatized recover. Most people are resilient. You only have about 10 or 20% of people that are traumatized that develop PTSD. So in order to do a study to try to show that you could somehow or other prevent people who've been traumatized from developing PTSD would require very large numbers of subjects, because there's going to be such a base rate of natural recovery that you're only showing a difference in a relatively small portion of those people, if indeed you can do it. So that from a scientific point of view, it's really way too expensive, and preventing trauma is also not a FDA approvable disorder either. So that there's really no practical way that I can see for us to do a study trying to prevent PTSD in healthcare workers that are traumatized. It would be a very important thing, and I think it could be very helpful, but to try to do it in a study where you want to persuade skeptics that you've actually got an intervention that's helping would be way too expensive. And so it's not practical. The other aspect of this is that in our protocol, which we call MT2, which is to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training, the primary outcome measure, one of the outcome measures that we proposed was a measure of burnout. And FDA has objected to that and saying that's not a disorder. Why are you doing this? It's part of their larger concerns about actually giving MDMA to therapists as part of the training. On the other hand, they gave us 20 more people in what we call MT1, which is where we are giving MDMA to therapists, but it's a 4-day process so that they have, 5-day. They come in the night before, then they either get MDMA or they get a placebo, then there's a day of integration, then there's a crossover, and then there's another day of integration. So FDA gave us permission to add 20 more people to that. So we're about 90 or so far. Now we can go up to 120 in that. But it's more expensive, and if we're not training people to do research, they don't need the placebo experience. If we're training them to do research where some half of the people or whatever percentage is actually going to get a placebo, then we want them to experience the placebo themselves and to know how to deliver as effective a therapy as possible. So those are the concerns practically and regulatory from trying to do anything with current healthcare workers who are traumatized. So what we basically say is that we need them to have chronic PTSD for at least 6 months, and then they can just volunteer for our studies or to expand it out. So I don't see any practical above ground way to help healthcare workers that are going through all this trauma. So that what I want to share now is I think I can share my screen a little bit. I'll get to it in just a second, but the most important reality check in our 34-year history has been the interim analysis. And some of you have already heard about it. We've shared our news with therapists in all of our teams, but many of you may have not have heard about it either. So basically what happens is the power of the pharmaceutical lobby is such that in normal times, normally you do a research project, you do your power calculations, you figure out what your statistical significance you'd like it to be, what probability of success, you power your study. And then you do the study and then you see if it succeeds. And in order to get FDA approval, you need 2 phase 3 studies that are statistically significant. And often a lot of pharmaceutical companies do 4 or 5 of them before they get 2 that succeed, and then their drug gets approved. But what's possible is to have an interim analysis conducted by a data monitoring committee that's unblinded, that takes a look at the data in process at a pre-negotiated point in time. And then they compare the actual data to the hypothetical data, and then they extrapolate forward. So we have to do 2 100-person phase 3 studies, and we negotiated with FDA, we would do the interim analysis at 60 people when all 100 had been enrolled. So we have 100 enrolled, 60% have reached their primary outcome measure, the rest are in some process of treatment, or they've been enrolled but they have are still withdrawing from their SSRIs or whatever. So what I'm going to share you, so this took place March 19th. So it was after the last meeting that we had. And I'm going to just share the screen about, okay. So for those of you that can see this, table 6. So what I want to start out by saying is that we designed the study conservatively, so that the top, meaning that we were willing to spend extra money to have more people than we might need for statistical significance. The FDA also required that. They said that you can prove efficacy for smaller numbers than you can prove safety. So we have to do 2 100-person studies. And so this is the effect size that various, okay, so this is the mean change in the CAPS-5 between the group that gets MDMA plus therapy and the group that gets therapy. So the first thing to say about this is that this is not like a normal study where we're comparing a treatment versus a placebo, because we're actually comparing psychotherapy, which is effective, with a placebo, with psychotherapy with MDMA. And we have to subtract the effect of the therapy from the effect of the MDMA plus therapy. So what that means is that the effect size that we're getting is only the effect of a part of our treatment, because it's very important, the therapy component. And we gather from our phase 2 data that the therapy alone is around 40% of the benefit of therapy plus MDMA. So the MDMA does more than the therapy. The therapy can make it ineffective or can help it be more effective. And so the effect size that we are generating, which is in phase 2, we had a large effect size. It's actually larger than it seems because we're having to subtract out the therapy component. All right, so these are the mean changes in the CAP scores between the groups. It's this effect size of 0.3. This is in the range of SSRIs. This is a small effect size. You get drugs approved for a small effect size. And so 0.44 is not really that good either. 0.5 is where it starts to be a medium effect size. And what these numbers mean is that an effect size of 1 means that you have moved the data 1 standard deviation better. So effect size is in terms of standard deviation. So, you know, they have a bell curve and people fall in it, you know, in different ways. Some are super responders, some don't respond. You know, more people are clustered in the middle. So an effect size of 1 means you've moved your average benefit to 1 standard deviation better. An effect size of 0 means that you haven't changed it at all. So our effect size in phase 2, and again, this is the therapy subtracted effect size, was 0.8. And so that's a large effect size. So we sized our phase 3 for 0.56. So you don't see 0.56 here on the table, but it was a slightly bigger mean change. And it gave us a 90% conditional power. So what that meant is that under 90% of, considering the variability, under 90% of the likely outcomes based on our hypothetical situations, which are really based on our phase 2 data, we would have a 90% chance to succeed. And pharma usually designs studies at the 80% level for conditional power to succeed. And so this shows, though, that as your effect size goes down, the mean change goes down, you have to add more and more people. This is the number of people that we would have to add to restore the probability to 90% success. So we spent a lot of time before the interim analysis trying to really understand all the hypotheses that that this is based on, and all the conditions, because the effect size, we figured 0.56, and the 90%, but what the interim analysis does is all it does is give me a number. And the number is either 0, that we don't need to add anybody, that we are on track for 90%. What they do is they take the data from the first 60, they take the variability, and then they run thousands and thousands of computer simulations about how this could come out, turning with all this variability. And then they'll say, okay, if 10% of them are outside the range, then you would fail, but 90% of them are inside the range, then you've got 90% conditional power. And the other big factor to say is that the FDA approves the drugs, and I said this before, on statistical significance, not on effect size. The FDA says if you have 2 statistically significant studies, that means there's an effect. It doesn't say anything about the size of the effect. It's a group level effect. And so the FDA will approve the drug, and they figure the marketplace will figure it out. Therapists will and doctors will either adopt the drug or they won't. Insurance companies will either pay for it or not. But maybe you will eventually figure out who are the top responders. You don't go for the mean effect. You sort out who's most likely to respond. So you get approval on statistical significance. And so the ability of the pharmaceutical companies to make it so that you could do this interim analysis means that if you have to add anybody, it means your effect wasn't as big as you thought. And that's either because the placebo effect was bigger, or the experimental effect was smaller, or the variability was greater. All those affect these calculations. And so if you have to add people, you will still get the drug approved, but it means it's not as strong an effect. And also it means that'll be harder for insurance companies to pay for it, and all of that. So, and you can see how rapidly the number of subjects you need to add to restore this 90% probability. So just at 89%, if we were, had this mean change, if we were at 0.44 instead of 0.56, we'd have to add 10 people. But it still means that we would have, if we didn't do that, we'd have an 89% probability of success anyway. And since it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 or so per person, this means that we would have been spending $500,000 for 1% of conditional power. And so once we get the number of what this interim analysis is, we have a decision to make, which is, do we even want to pay for it? We can just continue the study as is. So for example, if we had an 80% probability conditional power, we'd have to add 70 people. That's $3.5 million. Do we really want to do that? You know, and so that's a question. On the other hand, each phase 3 study we now estimate is costing around $10 million. So is it worth $3.5 million to have a 10% greater chance of success when we already are going to succeed 4 out of 5 times? These are the kind of things that we had to sort out before we got the results from the interim analysis. And to add to the drama, let me say that there's only 2 drugs that the FDA has considered a breakthrough therapy for PTSD. One of them is MDMA. The other is a drug called Tonmya by Tonix Pharmaceutical Company. And so they had their phase 3 study, and their interim analysis took place in February, and our interim analysis took place in March. So Tonmya's interim analysis, they reported it, and they were told to stop the study for futility after they had spent well over $100 million. So they've lost all that money. The drug was supposed to help people sleep. They would not have nightmares, supposedly. That would help their PTSD symptoms. So even if you have a breakthrough therapy, even if you're in phase 3, you can still fail a bunch. And the Tonmya example is is the most relevant. So the results of our interim analysis were as good as they could possibly be. We were told that we don't need to add anybody, that we already have at least a 90% probability of success, and we have at least a medium effect size. So that was an enormous relief. And what that means is that we believe, and we've shared this with the FDA, we believe we are on a track for success. There could be a whole bunch of people who get MDMA that commit suicide. That's not happened. We've had one suicide attempt that's in the placebo group. But there could be safety signals that are disturbing, that might impact approval. For whatever reason, all of a sudden, because of coronavirus, nobody can get better from PTSD. There's unknowns, but we think we're in incredibly good shape. So that's the main news. Is the most important reality check in our 34 years is that we are on track to success. The other part of this now is that the FDA has come back to us, and they're doing this to sponsors of all their studies. And they said, we understand that the coronavirus has slowed down or in some cases stopped your study. So while I said that we had 100 people enrolled, we actually had 105 people enrolled. 15 of them had not yet started the first experimental session. They were going through the tapering process. They were going through their non-drug psychotherapy sessions for preparation, but they hadn't started the first experimental session. And so all of that has been shut down. There was about 14 people that were in the process, had gotten 1 or 2 sessions, but hadn't completed their third experimental session. So the FDA came to us and said, do you want to shut the study down early? We will give you the opportunity to shut the study down early. Now, the more people you have in a study, the more likely you are to get statistical significance. So it's a risk on our part to shut the study down early, but maybe we'll still get statistical significance. And so we've thought a lot about that. And on Friday of the week before last Friday, we went to the FDA and we said, we would like to shut the study down at the end of June when we're going to have 90 people. And so far we have about 8 dropouts. We think 7 are in the placebo group, 1 is in the MDMA group. The MDMA guy dropped out because he felt he was cured after 2 sessions and didn't need the 3rd session. But we have missing data there. So, and that's okay. You can have a certain amount of missing data. We're going to have more missing data from those people that started treatment and then COVID blocked them from continuing. On the other hand, we have such a low dropout rate relative to most studies of traditional studies of PTSD that we're fine on that. And so at the end of June, we're going to have 90 people will have a baseline measure of their PTSD symptoms and at least a measure after 1 experimental session. And it's our sense that we're likely to get statistical significance from 90 people. And so we're waiting to hear from FDA if they're going to permit us to do that. There's certain things that are unclear in the sense that earlier FDA said we have to have 200 subjects for safety database. And if we shut down at 90, will they make the second MAP2 be 110 or will it just be 100? So we're not sure if we're saving anything. But the end of June is when you get the data from the 90. It takes us a month and a half to do the data lock and do all that, get the statistics. So before the end of August, we are going to know if our first of 2 studies was statistically significant. And if it was, that's going to be a tremendous statement that we are really on the way to success. So the interim analysis is great, but the final data is even more persuasive, and that will help our fundraising and everything. All right, so that's where we are with that. We're engaged in a $30 million fundraising campaign. As you know, Hopkins got $17 million for their research center. They got $8.5 million from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohn Foundation. And in an example of, what should I say, a small mistake that had big consequences. It turns out that Alex Cohn told me, so we've been meeting with her a bunch of times. She told me that she reached out to me first a year and a half ago as her first entry into the psychedelic community. And the message never got to me. Somehow or other, she called the MAPS office. She sent an email, whatever. Alex Cohn, maybe nobody knew who she was, but she reached out to me a year and a half ago, and I didn't respond. So then she did her other stuff. She met all these other people. She gave $8.5 million to Hopkins. And so then she got back in touch with me, and we were talking to her about a $10 million matching grant. We're trying to raise $30 million. Our clinical team's estimate of the costs of this was wrong. So we underestimated it. And of the 30 million, 10 million is for commercialization. It's assuming we're going to succeed. How do we commercialize? How do we ramp up the training program? How do we really develop the whole team that's going to be marketing and selling and set up all these agreements? And how do we get the actual MDMA out to the people that are going to be treating patients? So 20 million, and of the 20 million, around 3 million of that is contingency. We might not need it. We're loading up with experts who I think some of them we may not need either. But in any case, we were going to get this, we were applying for this $10 million matching grant from Alex Cohn, and I thought it was done in a great way, which was, if you give us a $10 million matching grant, we'll raise $10 million from our board of directors and close supporters that won't count towards the match. And then your match will go towards the final 10. So in any case, last week they told us that they've postponed all of their psychedelic giving to focus on COVID, and they might not get back to this till 2021. So we've been doing all sorts of other fundraising, and we're up to around $12 million already so far. So we're very hopeful. Things are going pretty good. We're going to continue this, but it's really been, the hardest time to raise money. Here's something I'm going to show you else that is going to be helping us a lot. So this is the magazine, if you can see this, of the Disabled American Veterans, the official voice. 1.3 million members, goes out in May or June.
Rick, you haven't finished the screen. We're still looking at all the numbers.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Let me just.
You may have to go out and come back in again.
Okay. Can you stop my screen share? I've had this problem before. Can you?
Yep, I will do it.
All right, and then I'll come back with the screen share. Okay, great.
Good, that's the way to do it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then here's the screen. Thanks. Okay, so here's the screen now. Okay.
We see it.
There's 1.3 million members of Disabled American Veterans. It goes out in print and online. This is the latest issue. Just came out the other day. This is your brain on drugs. You might start to be scary. No, this is your brain on drug-assisted psychotherapy. A common street drug may be key in the fight against PTSD. So this is the cover article, and they talk a lot about John Lubecki and our data. It's really a tremendous thing. But here's how they end. The Disabled American Veterans is supportive of continued research on non-traditional therapies, complementary and alternative medicine, and expanded treatment options for veterans, says Deputy National Legislative Director Adrian Atizado. Anything that can safely help our veterans heal from the lasting psychological impacts of war, particularly for those who tried treatment before without success, is worth studying further, which these trials are attempting to do. So this is just, we've circulated this to various people in the Department of Defense, in the VA, and they're all really impressed that the Disabled American Veterans have come out in such a positive way. So if you can stop my screen sharing again, those are just the two things I wanted to share. The rest I'll just talk. All right, so the other thing that's about happening is that any day now.
Rick, could you send that link to us and then we'll send it to the community? Oh, someone.
Yeah.
Actually,
Great.
Raman's done it. Thank you, Raman.
Okay, terrific. Okay. All right, so the other thing is that we are hearing any day now from the FDA about the protocol from Rachel Yehuda to take place inside the Bronx VA. We're still having to pay for it and find donors, but I've been trying for 30 years about trying to get research with MDMA for PTSD inside the VA. And we should hear any day now from the FDA whether they approve the protocol. We think they're going to approve it in general and reject it, some parts of it. So the parts that they're going to reject get back to this whole question about the credentials of therapists. And so we decided to make life hard for the FDA. In our phase 3, because we spent an extra 8 months and negotiated what's called special protocol assessment, we've come to agreement with FDA on the way phase 3 should be conducted. And they're legally bound to approve the drug if we get statistical significant evidence of efficacy and no new safety problems come. And they can't change the protocol, nor can we, unless we apply for an amendment. So that's what we did. And we agreed with them that of the 2-person team, the lead person is a therapist and the second person can be a student, doesn't have to have a license as being a therapist. And we don't have to have a doctor on site. So then, that was now in 2017. Then along comes Compass, along comes USONA. They start negotiating with FDA, and FDA starts freaking out a little bit. And so they now are starting to impose MD, PhD requirements on these other studies. And they started doing that for us too on MT2, on our next study to give MDMA to therapists. And also, so we've been objecting and objecting. And for the protocol from Rachel, we thought we're going to give the FDA a hard time. Rachel has doctors on site and she has enough MDs or PhDs to have one on every team. But we thought, why should we concede on that? Let's force the FDA to say no to a study at veterans using this same exact patient population that we're using in phase 3 without a physician on site and without MD, PhD lead. So that's how we presented it to FDA. FDA is now almost a month late. They have 30 days to reply. It would have been April 9th that they should have replied. So they're almost a month late. Yes, Corona and they're busy and stuff, but they're now violating their statutory requirements. And we think what's going to happen is that they are going to go ahead and give us approval for the protocol, but put a hold on the basis of the credentials, and we'll concede to get the study started. Okay, in the background, the other thing that's happened, which is really good, is that we just got, a week from last Friday, approval for a new study with MDMA for eating disorders. And also, I think at Hopkins and elsewhere, there's going to be psilocybin for eating disorders. Certainly, Robin Card-Harris is going to do that also. So within the 30-day period, the FDA came to us and they said, we want you to respond within 1 day. We don't want you to use anorexia people. We want you to only use binge eating disorders because anorexia people, we're worried about it. And we want a physician on site and we want an MD, PhD as the lead person. So what we did to them is we said to the FDA within this day, no, we're going to continue with anorexia people. Yes, we'll monitor their hearts. We'll do this sort of stuff, whatever. But we will agree to have a physician on site, but we will not agree to have MD, PhD as the lead person. If there's a physician on site, how can you possibly justify MD, PhD as the lead person? I mean, we didn't say it exactly that, but we just said there's no justification. And so we submitted our response back within 1 day. And then with 1 day back, FDA came back to us and said, we approve it. So the eating disorder study, 3 sites, Vancouver, Toronto, and Denver, will have a physician on site, but does not need to have MD, PhD as the lead therapist.
Great.
So that's a little bit of a step, but we don't want a physician on site. They're not necessary.
So we have run out of time. So if people need to leave, we certainly understand. And it's up to you, Rick, whether you want to keep going or, we could all listen to you all afternoon, but we've been sitting here a long time.
Okay, well, let me just add 1 minute more and then I'll be done.
1 minute.
One real minute, unless people have questions. So the real minute here is that we are now working with a fellow named Bob Kaufman, who is a military psychiatrist at Walter Reed.
We heard from Mark Bates earlier on about their study. So keep going. So,
okay. So did he talk about Barbara Van Dalen?
Nope.
Okay, so President Trump has appointed this woman, Barbara Van Dalen, to be the head of the President's Task Force on Reducing Suicides in Veterans. It's called PREVENTS, and she works out of the White House or elsewhere. So Bob Kaufman met her a couple weeks ago. Well, actually, it was like about a month ago. Actually, maybe 2 months ago, right before things shut down. So he met her at the White House. Barbara wants Bob Kaufman to be one of the national spokespeople for this event, for this program. And Bob told Barbara all about MDMA PTSD research, and she wanted to meet me, and so then we couldn't do that, and now she's going to set a time for us to meet by Zoom. So we're sort of getting the highest level of people that we can reach in this kind of field that have political connections, and so overall things are going great. I do see this one question about expanded access, just to say that yeah, they are on hold in part because we need to further train all the expanded access therapists, but we're hoping that that will start soon. And also to say that expanded access is not on hold by the FDA, because people who have PTSD have a different risk benefit, and you can take risks of your health of getting the virus if you've got an underlying condition that a protocol can help you with. So it's more about us trying to get the site set up and get everything, all the people properly trained.
Great.
Wow.
Thank you.
Concise.
Wow, well done, Rick.